Welcome to Destigmatizing Justice, the podcast where we tackle the tough conversations about conflict-related sexual violence against men. Brought to you by the Center for African Justice, Peace and Human Rights, we're here to break the silence, challenge the stigma, and champion the rights of all survivors. Join us as we explore expert insights and actionable steps towards justice and healing. Together, we can redefine justice because every voice matters. Good morning, my name is Sanya Mungeo, and I'm here with Emma Birikorang to discuss the importance of breaking the silence and the stigma with regard to conflict-related sexual violence against men and boys. Thank you so much, Miss Emma Birikorang, for joining us. And to start off, could you just tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and what led you to focus on conflict-related sexual violence against men and boys?
So my name is Emma Birikorang. I presently work at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center. And I'm basically a researcher, but my official designation is I'm the director for research here at the KIPTC. So my interest in conflict-related sexual violence broadly began maybe about 12 to 15 years ago, when we began conducting research on protection of civilians in conflict. And so we visited a number of countries, and one of those countries was the DR Congo. And obviously, when you're doing research on protection of civilians, you will encounter victims of sexual violence in your research. And so that is how we decided that we would zoom in a little bit further on the phenomena of conflict-related sexual violence. And so we did some further research on it. And then in our research, we also encountered a number of men and boys who had become victims to sexual violence. And so that also took us in that direction so that we could research further. So this work was done with my colleague, Dr. Fifi Eduafo, and myself. And this is the path that we have been on for the last 10 to 15 years.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, 10 to 15 years is quite some time to be tackling such an issue. And moving right on, we had a look at your publications and we were particularly drawn towards breaking the silence, the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And as you've just mentioned, that was your country of focus during your research in this matter. So could you please give us more of a specific overview or insight into sexual violence against men in conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo?
All right. Thank you so much for that. I think maybe before we go into that, sometimes when we talk about sexual violence in conflict, there's a bit of a misunderstanding in terms of how people conceptualize it. So it's important that we clarify really what the term means, what conflict-related sexual violence means. Obviously, sexual violence occurs in all kinds of settings, but when we talk about conflict-related sexual violence, it's talking about rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution. I think the UN even defines it in a lot of their reports: forced pregnancy, forced abortion, and forced sterilization, forced marriage, or any other form of sexual violence that is perpetrated against women, men, girls, boys, that is directly or indirectly linked to a conflict. So there has to be a conflict prevailing in that particular society, and which so that you can make a direct or indirect link to it. And so when it comes to the DR Congo, obviously, as we all know, the DR Congo is a country in conflict. And so you would find that sexual violence is prevalent in that country. Beyond that, there's also sexual violence that is directly linked to conflict. Now we've seen that increasingly sexual violence has become a consequence of war. It's become something that perpetrators do deliberately against victims, against their enemies, because they see the devastating impact that it has on the individual, the community, the group, as well as the society in general. So that is why you find that it's become a very special weapon of war. In the DRC, it's become a major issue and I think the statistics went down a bit, but in the last year or two, we've seen that the conflict has reignited. And so you see that the statistics have started going up again, where increasingly you have a lot of men and boys and women and girls who have become victims of sexual violence in conflict. When it comes to sexual violence against men and boys, it is really very underreported. Not a lot is said about it. You won't read too many literature on conflict-related sexual violence against men and boys, but it is happening. The reason why you won't see a lot of literature on it is because obviously a lot of the victims are women and girls. That is fundamentally clear. But if you look at the figures, at least 10% of victims are men and boys. The majority of victims are women. And so it is right that attention is centered on the majority of victims. That, however, does not mean that the 10% should be left or out of the picture, because they are also relevant. They are also members of the society. So their needs should also be taken into consideration. And so that is really the state of play when it comes to sexual violence against men and boys.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was very insightful. And I'm very drawn to the fact that you've mentioned that sexual violence is somewhat a weapon of war. And some authors also talk about it as being even as grand as an act of terrorism. And we've talked a little bit about it being underreported because women and girls are prioritized. But I'd also like to get your input on why it's misunderstood more from like a social aspect.
I think if you look at our socialization, um, society sees men and women in different ways, right? So it's really about how men are conceptualized in society and how women are conceptualized in society. Men are supposed to behave in certain ways. Women are supposed to behave in certain ways. Men are supposed to feel certain things or not feel certain things, but women might be allowed to feel those things, So we talk about broadly about the term masculinities, right? So if you look in a lot of the literature, it talks about how men and boys should behave, how they should be treated, how they should dress, how they should appear, what they should succeed at, what attitude and qualities that those men should have, right? And so when you have those men who might not necessarily be behaving that way, dressing that way, appearing that way, or succeeding in the way they should, then that becomes a problem. And so this is where we use a term, hegemonic masculinity, right? Where people personify a certain characteristic to maintain a strategic position in many aspects of everyday life. But that then turns against men in a certain way, because those that perpetrate sexual violence against men and boys also see themselves in that way because they see themselves as domineering over others. Okay. And so hegemonic masculinity is where a certain group of people, males, feel that they should dominate a certain group of people, right? Those group of people who are subservient to them. Now, it doesn't matter whether those group of people are male or female, as long as they see that group of people are subservient to them, then they would dominate those people. And so the people that exhibit those characteristics, they see women, they see boys, they see girls, they see men, their fellow men, who sometimes they classify as the other, right? And so they are able to dominate those other groups of people and perpetuate different types of violence against them. And obviously, as we know, sexual violence can be one of the most devastating forms of violence that anyone can experience.
Yeah, exactly. And just to go back on that, we talk about it as perpetuating a toxic cycle where the perpetrator is dominant over or domineering over the boy or man who is a victim, and later on the cycle just continues and no one really talks about it. And just in connection to all this, we talk about the impact of silence. What does silence and invisibility do to the individual and the community?
Well, Senyamo, silence is actually a weapon, right? Because it makes perpetrators stronger. And it is one of the things that also weakens victims. And there's a reason why there's the silence associated with sexual violence, because it comes with a lot of shame. It comes with a lot of stigma. How our society views sexual violence is totally wrong, because even female victims can sometimes have a lot of stigma. And so you find that when we are talking about sexual violence and encouraging victims to come out, you see slogans such as "Break the Silence." In the DR Congo, they said "Briser le silence," right? And it became a slogan where they wanted people to speak against it, to speak about it, talk about it. Because the more you talk about it, the easier it becomes for victims to come forward, for victims to see that, okay, they are not the only ones that have suffered this particular deed. And so it is easier for them to come forward and receive the help that they need. Now, the challenge with the Briser le silence is because this was a campaign that targeted mostly females, and rightly so, as I indicated. But we need to focus a little bit more attention on ensuring that men also break the silence. We need to not normalize it. We need to normalize breaking the silence for males as well, right? And so even in the campaign posters, to not just show female images, girl images, to show boys images, male images, so that everybody knows that, okay, sexual violence is not only something that happens to girls and women, but something that also happens to boys and men. That makes it easier, first of all, for health workers. It makes it easier for security institutions. It makes it easier for justice institutions to know that this is a phenomenon that happens. Sanyamo, you'd be very surprised that when you talk to a regular service provider and you tell them that males also suffer from sexual violence, the first reaction is shock, surprise. They do not think that it's even possible, right? But that's because we haven't broken the silence when it comes to that phenomena. So when we break that silence, then it becomes easier for male victims when they report their cases to be believed. Because right now, most male victims do not report because believability for male sexual violence is low. The stigma is strong. And so when a male or a boy overcomes that stigma and reports and believability is low, then they recall into their shell, even though they are suffering. And sometimes their suffering is not just psychological. There is also a lot of physical suffering that male victims endure, and they need a lot of help. But because of the stigma associated with it, a lot of them do not report and they suffer in silence, which is really very unfortunate.
I completely agree. And I think you brought up a very interesting point when you were talking about ways to increase invisibility. And one of them is sharing images when you're doing training or when you're doing outreach work, just sharing images also of boys and men. And it's just so rare that that happens. And also, it reduces sexual violence to be a women's problem. So I'm also going to go into a very specific topic, especially concerning African countries. And that's the issue of homosexuality as a crime. And I just want to find out, do you think that criminalization of homosexuality is instilling fear in even male victims where they don't know how to go out and talk about their experience or the crimes against them just out of fear of being persecuted?
Well, yes, I mean, that is a phenomena. And we've seen that happen because when you look at a lot of the victims of male sexual violence, and if I can be, a bit graphic, right? Male sexual violence comes in various forms, right? So there is what um, is generally called sodomization, essentially, um, which I think you'd find in a lot of the laws against homosexuality in African country. So there's also a lot of physical injury. Sometimes, and when we did the research in DR Congo, we encountered a lot of victims, and some of the things that they said were really very, very very painful to hear, right? So if I can quote some of them, if you don't mind, um, there were victims of sexual violence who experienced physical injuries. Some of them had redness, fluid draining from the ear, pus-like fluid inside their ear, and this was because people had forcefully ejaculated into their ears, right? Um, there are also contusions stemming from the blunt use of force from the boots of soldiers and other armed groups. Um, there were also some who had bruises, lacerations, bite marks because their genitalia had been bitten. Some had their genitalia tied with ropes and pulled very, very forcefully. Um, Oftentimes, when males report such cases, the first question they are asked is, who is the perpetrator, right? Whether perpetrators males or females. And oftentimes, because of our society, because of our laws on homosexuality, a lot of victims might not even want to go and report because they'll find that if their perpetrator is a male and they had been forcefully penetrated, then there's the stigmatization associated to that is at a different level because then they are seen in a different light by their communities, right? So they would not want to talk about it. So our laws really are also one of the reasons why a lot of men and boys may not necessarily want to report sexual violence that has been perpetrated against them.
It's always just so devastating to hear about the layers of abuse, but I appreciate the fact that you went into detail and gave victim accounts, mostly because it's also quite hard to find. Like I said, it's underreported and often misunderstood. So I'd also want to join the next question with this entire discussion. Do you think that there is a difference in intention and impact on sexual violence against men as compared to sexual violence against women?
I I think that for me the intention might not be different, right? In war, because we've already said that sexual violence has become a weapon of war. It is one of the most devastating human rights abuses um, that can be committed against anybody, because it's really against your person, your physical being, right? And so it's really, the impact is felt on all levels. Okay, the physical, the psychological, the emotional, and everything else, right? So for males and females, I wouldn't say there is much of a difference in terms of the intention, because in conflict, now perpetrators might not necessarily go out looking for male or female victims. It is whomever they encounter along their path, right? And and obviously there are gender dimensions of conflict, you know, and you find that the reason why a lot more victims are female is because, well, in a lot of conflicts, most females are vulnerable. They don't have a lot of resources. Some of them have to stay back in their communities so that they can take care of their sometimes aged children and other, staying back to take care of their communities, essentially. You find that a lot of the males might join the conflict, or they might run away, or they have other coping mechanisms. So it is often very rare to have male victims of sex. That is why it is often rare to find male victims of sexual violence, because a lot of men do not want to be victims, so they would rather be perpetrators. They'll join the group that will do the perpetration of the violence, right? And so the intention of perpetrators might not necessarily be to look for male victims or female. It's whomever they encounter. But for the male victims, or for the perpetrators against male victims, I think a lot of them, it's more about emasculating their fellow men, because they feel that when they have treated their fellow men and boys in that way, it makes them less of a male. And that is why a lot of the men feel such pain and stigma when they go through such experiences, because it makes them lose their masculinity. It makes them lose their how society perceives them. They see themselves as weak in the eyes of society, because now they are victims. And so it becomes more difficult for them to report. And that is why the male stigmatization is different to a certain extent from the female stigmatization, because of how society sees males and females. It's okay for women to be victims to a certain extent. But a man, because of how society sees you, you cannot be a victim.
That's exactly what I think as well. In general, the intention remains the same. It's to humiliate, it's to dominate, and it's to instill fear. And just to echo what you said, maybe the difference with the men is to emasculate as well. And that's just the most grand gesture of humiliation from a man to a man, especially in conflict. And just going back a bit earlier, also, we talked about how the statistics in the DRC had gone down and now they've spiked back up due to the ongoing conflict. Regardless of timeline and the situations, what do you think are long-term consequences for the victims, their families, and their communities, even post-conflict?
Sexual violence has such devastating consequences on everybody associated with it, right? So if you look at a lot of victims, there is the physical, right? The physical violence to start with. Beyond that, there's also the psychological impact of sexual violence. The political, a lot of victims, the emotional you'll find that a lot of victims might experience nightmares. Some of them might have flashbacks. Some have depression. Some have low self-esteem. There are also some, as you said, who, because of the experiences, strong fear is instilled in them. And a lot of them even have post-traumatic stress disorder. And what happens with such things is that it has an impact on their immediate partners, their immediate communities, right? So what we call the significant others, right? So you'd find that they will visit the violence that they sometimes have experienced on their significant partners, because obviously pain needs an outlet. And when that outlet is not forthcoming, it exhibits in different ways, in not so good, in negative ways. So it can exhibit in violence, it can exhibit in other types of abuse. So there are victims who, because they have been raped or sodomized or other type of sexual violence, they will in turn try to rape other people or rape females so that they can get their masculinity back, because they want to find again that masculinity that they think they have lost. So that has a major effect on their significant others. When it comes to at the national level, obviously, because of all the psychological impacts, the pain, the physical impacts, that the emotional turmoil, oftentimes the whole society tends to suffer. First of all, because people would want to move from where they have experienced the violence. And so economic activities in those particular areas will reduce significantly. So you find that in the DR Congo, you've seen that reduction in crop production, market activity has reduced. There's been impact on mining, and other forms of support to the country. There are even poor economic outlook, especially when it comes to forestry, mining, the oil sector, because a lot of the males might have been working in these areas. And because they have been victims, or they think they are going to be victims, they would move away from these places where they think they would be victimized. So the entire thing has an impact on the society.
That's very interesting because entirely we know that a very big trauma response is escaping. And we've talked about escaping the trauma by maybe instilling it on other people or just retreating and never talking about it. But it's so rare to hear also the fact that the economy suffers because they want to physically escape the place of their pain. And that just goes to show how vast the effects of sexual violence against men and boys in conflict goes. And just to go further into now the community, are there, from your perspective, any legal frameworks or humanitarian organizations that have done enough or have adequately addressed the needs of male victims?
From our research, there are a few NGOs that look at sexual violence against males and females, but that's really few and far between, just one or two, right? A lot of them would focus on female victims. Because obviously of the stigmatization and the fact that the males do not come out. We discussed with an NGO that was offering psychosocial support to female sexual victims. And they indicated that often it is when they bring the females, or the females come to them, that they tell them that there were certain boys or men who were part of their group that were also victimized. And so sometimes these NGOs will do outreach programs to try and draw in some of the male victims. But it's obviously very difficult. I mean, if you look at a place like DR Congo is such a huge place, right? The country is big, the road networks. If you add this to weak governance and inadequate institutional capacity, where you don't have a lot of data on male sexual violence in a lot of the provinces, then it's really difficult to give the right support to those that need it the most. The other thing too is the fact that sometimes you get a sense that there's a bit of a poor coordination amongst all the various actors that are providing support to sexual violence victims. And that's obviously for both males and females. It almost seems as if each one is focusing on one aspect or the other of it. So when it comes to sexual violence, they are, in terms of addressing it, there's a justice component, isn't it? There is a service component. And then there's a security response. The justice is where it is not only about treating the persons physically, but also getting them the justice that they need. If someone offends somebody, if someone does wrong to another person, the justice component is really very important to the person. So the justice component needs to be catered for. The service is where, if they have some trauma, if they need some social support, the service is where that helps them to reintegrate back into society. And then there's also the security response. The security response is where you are removing the threat element completely, right? Now, if we look at the present circumstances of DR Congo, do we see any of these three things happening? Because of the institutional weaknesses that they have. Weak governance, lack of state presence in many communities. And we've seen that, unfortunately, Goma has been taken, Bukavu has been taken, and these are some of the places that we went to for the research. And now that rebel groups have taken control of those places, you will see a spike, and we've seen prisoners being raped and burned. There's a report recently of females in prison wards who were raped and they were burnt because they didn't want the evidence to go out, right? And I'm not surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if there are males who were part of that, because a lot of victims, especially during war, a lot of male victims of sexual violence are prisoners of war, those that have been captured. And the perpetrators sometimes will be prison wardens, and they are associates. So I wouldn't be surprised if, amongst the statistics of people that had been raped and burned recently, there were one or two males who were part of it, because we met victims in prisons who had been traumatized by prison guards. And obviously, even the justice system that they have, if it's present, it's really very weak. And so you would find that in places where the males even have the courage to report, a lot of the time, because justice takes such a long time. Now, if we look at the how do you call it, the cycle, right? The entire cycle of meeting the needs of victims. There's obviously the medical side, there's the psychosocial, the judicial, the reparation, and then the reintegration. Now, how many victims are able to go through that entire cycle? The justice structure is really very weak, and it is not cheap. So you find that some NGOs would support victims and take their cases forward. But sometimes the victims might not even show up after the case delays for so long. And so they'll try and, in DR Congo, they call it arrangement amiable, amicable settlement, where some compensation is paid to the victim and then the case dies. So these are ways in which it becomes really very difficult to tackle sexual violence against men and boys.
We can summarize the entire thing in the first three components that you mentioned. We talked about the justice, service, and security, and these three need to be fulfilled entirely. And also, I think from my perspective, I think the amicable settlement is definitely insufficient, and you should not be given, to put it lightly, hush money so that you do not talk about your problems. And that also takes away a lot of the accountability of the perpetrators and really reduces justice in the future. And just to go into that, do you think that with the recent escalation of conflict in Goma, do you think the DRC and the International Accountability Fora have ensured any sort of evolution?
I wouldn't say so. Because the conflict has escalated, and when conflict escalates, it's really about just fighting the fire, right? You deal with the consequences later. And so I don't think people are even seeking out victims now. Um, Victims would have to find some solace elsewhere in the meantime, because even those that are supposed to provide support for the victims are not present because of the dangerous circumstance, which is why we talk about the security component, because you need to remove the threat so that victims can get the support that they need. And the more conflict escalates, um, the worse sexual violence atrocities increases, right? So because the conflict has escalated, and you find that, sometimes we think sexual violence is only perpetrated by rebel groups. So for example, in DR Congo, we are thinking is the M23, but there are other sub-state actors, right? So in DR Congo, there are all kinds of tribal militias, defense groups who also wield weapons, who also sometimes see other ethnic groups as their enemies, and they perpetrate violence against them. So beyond the broader umbrella of um, M25 against the FARDC, there are other sub-state groups that are also operating at the community level, who are also perpetrating all kinds of violence. And so victims are having a very raw deal, because it seems as if, that those that are supposed to give them support, we know that MONUSCO is no longer on ground. Even if they are there, they themselves are struggling to secure themselves, to protect themselves, right? Much less protect victims. And so Goma, it's such a beautiful place, and I'm thinking about Goma, I'm thinking about Bukavu, thinking about all the beautiful people and the struggle that I can imagine they are going through now, and with reduced support, even when the UN and other NGOs and humanitarian actors on the ground, the situation still persisted. So you can imagine now that, these groups are at reduced capacity, what the fate of the victims is at the moment. And that's really breaks my heart, honestly.
All in all, it is a very heartbreaking conversation to have, but it's so extremely necessary. And maybe together we can summarize by discussing some lessons from past failures. What lessons can we take from the past, or even right now, what lessons could we take from the issue in the DRC and carry it forward with regard to male victims of conflict-related sexual violence and conflict?
I think for me, the key thing is to break the silence when it comes to male victims of sexual violence. If we are able to overcome that, if we are able to break that silence, because in spite of the limited support, there is some support, right? So first of all, let's break the silence. Let's normalize male victims seeking support. If we normalize male victims seeking support, if we reduce the stigma attached to sexual violence, then it's easier for victims to seek the support that they need. The other thing too is the type of support that is available to them. For a lot of the male victims, if they do not have any physical injuries, it seems as if they do not get the support that they need. Sometimes they need to demonstrate pain. They need to demonstrate that they've undergone some form of torture before they are believed, right? And that, I think, is wrong in the first place. So the psychosocial support for male victims is really very important. The other thing also is a coordination amongst all those actors that provide support for male victims and boys and men, right? That it's important that each actor knows what the other is doing, because no actor can do everything by themselves. It is not just about providing psychosocial support. There are certain victims that want justice, right? So if you give them the psychosocial support and you don't point them in to where they can get justice, then, even though they have received the psychosocial support, because the justice mechanisms are not forthcoming, they still feel inadequate. And so it's important that all the various actors working to support victims, male victims, work together. And I think that collaboration is really missing. So I think that is really one thing that we need to emphasize. The other thing too is, obviously this is a much bigger fruit to, it's not low hanging, but stopping conflict, right? Stopping conflict. Because if there's no conflict, it wouldn't be conflict-related sexual violence. I'm not saying that sexual violence doesn't exist, but there's sexual violence that's directly and indirectly associated to conflict. And that is what we are talking about. So when the conflict is not there, that type of sexual violence will not happen. So it's important that the conflict is tackled. We've seen in DR Congo that the conflict has erupted again. In Goma, Bukavu, I don't even know which other places they might be taking, right? And you see again that the statistics would increase significantly. In 2023, if you look every year, the SRSG for sexual violence in conflict issues a report. And we see that in 2023, the numbers went up. You would find that in 2024, when the report comes out in 2025, the numbers will jump exponentially because the conflict has reignited. So as conflict prevails, sexual violence related to conflict will also increase.
And in summary, I think the one thing that's very, very heavily connected to the mandate of the Center for African Justice's sexual violence team is the very first point you said, and it's also very integral for the victim. To break the cycle, we need to break the silence. And it just needs to be something that we encourage male victims to speak out, and we need to make it possible for them to do that without the stigma. And yes, I totally appreciate this entire conversation. Your insight has been extremely valuable, and I couldn't have asked for anything more from you.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure, Sanya. And for me, I think the fact that it's not really just about DR Congo. There are so many other places where this prevails. If you look in the SRSG's reports, Sudan, South Sudan, Myanmar, Central African Republic, Yemen, Somalia, it doesn't seem to be ending, right? And that is really very, very heartbreaking, because as conflict prevails, the threat also will not abate. So it's important that the entire international community, where they feel they have support, address the root causes of these conflicts. The firefighting might seem nice and good, but it's important that we address this conflict. If you look at a place like La Côte d'Ivoire, for example, that was one of the places where sexual violence was really very prevalent many years ago. But you see that these days they are not even mentioned in the report because the conflict has ended, right? And so it's important that we address the root causes of conflict in all these places where conflict exists, because that's where we can reduce the threat of sexual violence. Because sexual violence is a weapon of war. It is a weapon of war. So when you reduce the war, then you take the weapon away from them.
Thank you so much, Emma. And thank you for agreeing to be on the podcast. And hopefully together and with our listeners and with the greater community, we just keep on stigmatizing justice.
Thank you so much for having me. Hopefully we look forward to collaborating more and with centers such as yours, providing justice to victims, working together with the justice providers, working together with security entities to support male victims of sexual violence. I thank you so much for throwing light on this particular issue that is very dear to our hearts.
Thank you for tuning into Destigmatizing Justice. We hope today's episode sparked your interest and inspired you to act. Please share it with others and join the conversation on our social media platforms. Let's keep dismantling stigma and building a world where justice is genderless. Until next time, remember that awareness is the first step towards change.